4:15 in the afternoon. The Strait of Hormuz. Destroyer DDG-67 USS Cole was already carving a white, foaming wake through the heavy turquoise waters of the western approach. The mission was not a standard transit, and the tension on the bridge was a physical weight pressing down on the sailors who stood at their stations. Every eye was locked on the primary tactical display, where a single blue icon flickered with a data tag that simply did not make sense. The automated identification system, the digital heartbeat of global commerce, was broadcasting the signal of the Sea Pearl, a Panamanian-flagged crude oil tanker, known to be carrying 2 million barrels of oil. But the Sea Pearl was not supposed to be moving at 34 knots. The unanswered question hung in the recycled air of the bridge. Why was a massive, slow-moving merchant vessel suddenly behaving like a high-performance surface combatant? The environment around the destroyer was a study in oppressive heat and deceptive calm. The sun sat low and angry on the horizon, turning the surface of the Persian Gulf into a sheet of polished brass. Humidity hung over the water in a thick, salty haze that reduced visual range to less than 5 miles, even as the ANSPY-1 radar cut through the mist with invisible precision. The deck beneath the boots of the crew vibrated with the steady, deep-throated hum of the 4 gas turbine engines, pushing the ship forward at 25 knots. Commander Sarah Hayes, the commanding officer of the USS Cole, stood by the central console. She did not look at the windows. She looked at the signature. The signature element of this encounter was the spoofing. The vessel on the screen was broadcasting a false digital identity, a perfect mimicry of the Sea Pearl's transponder. It was a sophisticated electronic mask, designed to allow a predator to hide in plain sight among the hundreds of commercial ships that choked this narrow corridor every day. "Range to the contact?" Hayes asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of the adrenaline that was likely surging through the younger sailors. "On the bridge. Range is 9 miles and closing, ma'am," the tactical action officer replied. His hands hovered over the glass surface of his station. "Target is maintaining a heading of 095. That puts him on a direct intercept course with the central shipping lane. If he keeps this speed, he will cross the 12 nautical mile limit into international waters in less than 4 minutes." The commanding officer leaned forward. The USS Cole was positioned as a shield. Between the approaching contact and the international lane were 3 massive container ships and a liquid natural gas carrier. If the contact was an Iranian military vessel disguised as a tanker, its intent was likely a forced boarding or a provocative close-quarters maneuver. The Fifth Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment, dated 3 days prior, had assessed Iranian AIS spoofing capability as experimental and non-operational. Hayes muttered, more to herself than to her crew. It was a piece of intelligence she had read in the quiet of her cabin, a reassurance from analysts thousands of miles away that the enemy was not yet capable of this level of digital deception. But the screen did not lie. The electronic signature said Sea Pearl, but the radar cross-section and the wake pattern were far too small, far too sharp. The contact was cutting through the water, like a knife, not pushing through it like a wall. "Bridge. Combat." A voice crackled over the internal communications loop. "We have a visual via the long-range optical sensor, breaking through the haze now." On the main monitor, the grainy, grayscale image of the horizon suddenly resolved into a sharp silhouette. It was not a tanker. It was an Alvand-class frigate, its narrow hull and forward gun mount unmistakable against the backdrop of the setting sun. The Iranian flag was visible, a small splash of color against the haze. The frigate was lean, low, and accelerating. The USS Cole responded instantly. The destroyer heeled to starboard, the deck tilting as the rudders swung. The sound of the wind screaming past the bridge windows increased as the ship moved into a blocking position. The commanding officer watched the distance close. 8 miles. 7 miles. The Iranian frigate showed no signs of slowing down. It was a game of maritime chicken played with thousands of tons of steel and high explosives. The scent of ozone and salt spray drifted through the open vents as the air conditioning struggled against the rising exterior heat. The USS Cole was now the only thing standing between the Iranian military and the most crowded shipping lane in the world. The Iranian frigate was no longer a ghost on the digital display. It was a sharp, steel reality cutting through the salt haze. Commander Hayes watched the range indicator. It dropped with a steady, mechanical rhythm. 4 miles. 3 miles. The Iranian vessel was now clearly within the 12-mile limit. It had crossed the invisible line into the international shipping lane. The air on the bridge was cold from the industrial air conditioning. Outside, the world was a furnace. The smell of salt spray and hot turbine exhaust filled the intake vents. The destroyer, DDG-67, heeled again. The ship was pushing its structural limits. The deck tilted beneath the boots of the bridge crew. The Iranian captain did not veer off. He was heading straight for the projected path of a Japanese container ship. The container ship was 4 miles away. It was a mountain of steel moving at 20 knots. It could not turn quickly. It was a captive target. The USS Cole moved to block. This was the shoulder maneuver. The destroyer would put its hull between the aggressor and the merchant vessel. It was a wall of gray metal against a reckless intruder. Hayes grabbed the radio handset. Iranian vessel on my bow. This is United States Warship 67. You are entering a restricted shipping lane. Alter your course to starboard immediately. There was no answer. Only the hiss of white noise and static. The Iranian frigate accelerated. The wake behind it grew long and jagged. It was now moving at 36 knots. This was much faster than the intelligence reports had predicted. Those reports had said the Iranian engines were poorly maintained. They said the vessel was barely seaworthy. That assessment was wrong. The frigate was screaming through the water. The distance was now 2,000 yards. The crew of the Cole could see the Iranian sailors on their deck through binoculars. The sailors were manning the forward gun. The turret was moving. It was tracking the destroyer. It was a cold, mechanical eye following their every move. Action stations, Hayes said. Her voice was a whip crack in the silent bridge. The alarm sounded through the ship. It was a rhythmic, pulsing scream. Men and women ran to their battle positions. They moved with practiced, frantic speed. The smell of ozone and human sweat grew stronger in the tight corridors. The USS Cole was ready. But the Iranian vessel was not slowing down. It was aiming for the destroyer's midships. It was a high-stakes game of nerves, played with thousands of tons of explosives. The sun was now a deep, bloody red. It cast long, distorted shadows across the flight deck. The signature element remained active. The Iranian automated identification system was still screaming that it was a tanker. Even though it was now less than a mile away, the digital lie was persistent. The screens in the Combat Information Center showed a merchant ship. The eyes of the lookouts showed a warship. 1,000 yards, the lookout called. The two ships were now so close they could feel the vibration of each other's engines. The Cole shuddered as it hit the frigate's wash. The water was a churned, white mess between them. The sea was boiling with the force of their passage. Then, the Iranian frigate turned. It was a violent maneuver. It did not turn away. It turned toward the Cole. The frigate leaned so far over its deck, took on water. The gap closed to 500 yards. The Iranian bridge was visible now. Hayes could see the glass reflecting the red sun. She saw a flash of light from their bridge wing. It was not a signal lamp. It was a lens. Someone was watching them back. Someone was measuring the distance for a shot. Bridge. Combat, the tactical officer said. Target fire control radar just went active. They are painting us. The intelligence brief from 3 days ago was wrong again. The radar was not broken. It was not in a state of disrepair. It was locked onto the Cole. The system was fully operational and looking for a solution. The Iranian frigate, identified as the Alvand, was a lean predator. Its hull was painted a dull, seafoam gray. The paint was peeling in long, ugly strips near the waterline, but its engines were healthy. They pumped out a thick, greasy cloud of black smoke. The smoke trailed behind the ship like a funeral shroud. The USS Cole was a much larger ship. It was a wall of advanced technology. The destroyer carried 96 vertical launch cells. It carried a 5-inch gun. It was designed to fight entire fleets, but in these tight waters, size was a liability. There was no room to maneuver. There was no room to breathe. The Japanese container ship began to blow its whistle. 5 short blasts. The international signal for danger. The sound rolled across the water. It was a deep, mournful lowing. It echoed off the Iranian hull like a warning from the deep. Hayes looked at the tactical display. The Cole was now sandwiched. The container ship was on her port side. The Iranian frigate was on her starboard. They were in a narrow corridor of water. Constant bearing, decreasing range, the navigator reported. His voice was tight. The environment was turning hostile. The wind began to pick up. It whipped the tops of the waves into jagged white caps. The spray hit the bridge windows. It left white streaks of salt as it dried. The heat outside was over 100 degrees. The crew in the Combat Information Center was buried in data. They were tracking the frigate's every move. The reality was 36 knots of pure aggression. The frigate was skipping over the waves. Its bow was lifting out of the water. It was a display of raw power. "Warn them again," Hayes ordered. The bridge wing speakers boomed. The warning was given in English and Farsi. The voice was loud enough to vibrate the deck plates beneath their feet. "You are standing into danger. Turn to starboard now, or we will be forced to take defensive measures." The Iranian frigate did not flinch. It held its course. It was now 300 yards away. The sailors on the Cole's deck could see the rust on the Iranian gun mount. They could see the faces of the Iranian crew. The Iranians looked young. They looked determined. The air smelled of unburned diesel. It was the heavy, greasy smell of a ship pushed to its limit. The USS Cole's own engines were roaring. The destroyer was vibrating so hard, the coffee in the bridge mugs was jumping. "Range 200 yards, the lookout shouted. This was the moment of decision. If the Cole turned, the frigate would hit the container ship. If the Cole held, there would be a collision. The signature element was still there. The transponder signal for the Sea Pearl was still being broadcast. It was a digital ghost haunting the real world. Suddenly, the Iranian ship veered. It cleared the Cole's bow by less than 50 yards. The wake hit the destroyer like a physical blow. The USS Cole rolled hard to port. The crew grabbed for handrails. "They're crossing our bow," the navigator yelled. The frigate was now between the Cole and the merchant lane. It had breached the defensive line. It was heading for the heart of the traffic. "Follow them," Hayes said. Her eyes were hard. "Do not let them get near that tanker." The pursuit through the haze of the Strait of Hormuz was now a race against time and geography. Destroyer DDG-67, USS Cole, pushed through the churned water at 32 knots. The ship was a vibrating steel beast of 8,900 tons. Every deck plate hummed with the power of the gas turbines. The air in the engine room was a thick, oily heat of 140 degrees. The sailors there worked in a daze of sweat and noise. Commander Sarah Hayes stood on the bridge, her hand gripping the cold steel rail. She watched the gap between the ships. The Iranian frigate was a dark shape against the shimmering heat of the horizon. It was a predator in its home waters. The Strait of Hormuz was not an ocean. It was a funnel. At its narrowest, it was only 21 miles wide. It was the throat of the global economy. 1/5 of the world's oil passed through this narrow strip of blue every day. If the Iranian frigate caused a collision, the throat would close. The Japanese container ship, the MV Kiso, was now less than 2 miles from the Iranian vessel. The Kiso was carrying thousands of steel boxes filled with electronics. It was a slow, clumsy giant. It had no weapons. It had no way to defend itself against a 30-knot warship. The bridge of the Cole was dark except for the glow of the tactical consoles. The signature element was still causing chaos on the digital screens. The Iranian automated identification system continued to scream its digital lie. To every other civilian ship in the area, the Iranian frigate looked like the Sea Pearl. It looked like a friendly, slow-moving tanker. The civilian captains were confused. Their radar told them one thing. Their identification systems told them another. The Fifth Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment dated 3 days prior. had assessed Iranian AIS spoofing capability as experimental and non-operational. The tactical action officer read the line again from his secure tablet. The words felt like a betrayal. It was a failure of imagination. It was a failure of intelligence. The Iranians were not using experimental gear. They were using a combat-ready system that was working perfectly. It was creating a digital fog of war that favored the aggressor. The intelligence failure did not stop at the transponder. The same briefing had assessed the Iranian frigate's fire control radar as a legacy system. It was supposed to be a relic from the 1970s. It was supposed to be prone to overheating and signal drift. But the electronic support measures on the Cole told a different story. The pulse coming from the Iranian ship was clean. It was sharp. It was a modern, solid-state signal. The Iranians had upgraded their eyes. They could see the Cole with a clarity the Americans had not predicted. They were not just painting the destroyer. They were tracking individual sections of the hull. They were looking for the weak points in the armor. The environment outside was turning more hostile by the minute. The sun was a flat, white disk in a sky the color of dirty brass. The wind had shifted. It was now blowing off the Iranian coast. It brought the smell of dry earth and old oil. The waves were short and choppy. They slapped against the hull of the Cole with a sound like pistol shots. "They are moving into the outbound lane," the navigator reported. The Iranian frigate was now cutting across the traffic flow. It was a suicidal move in any other context. But here, it was a weapon. The Kisa was forced to turn hard to port to avoid a collision. The massive merchant ship leaned. Its containers groaned as the lashing strained. The Cole followed. The destroyer was a shadow. It was a guardian that refused to be shaken. Commander Hayes watched the Iranian ship. She saw the flash of their navigation lights. They were signaling. But they were not signaling to the Cole. They were signaling to the shore. The Iranian coast was a wall of red, jagged mountains. Hidden in those mountains were batteries of anti-ship missiles. There were swarms of fast attack boats waiting in the coves. The frigate was the bait. It was the lure. It was trying to draw the Cole closer to the rocks. "Maintain distance," Hayes ordered. "Do not let them pull us into the shallows." The water depth was dropping. It went from 60 meters to 40 meters in less than a mile. The sonar team was monitoring the bottom. The signature of the Iranian spoofing was now flickering. The system was struggling with the high speed of the vessel. For a second, the Sea Pearl icon vanished. In its place was the true identity of the frigate, the Alvand. The air on the bridge was static charged. Everyone felt it. The intelligence brief was wrong about the radar. It was wrong about the spoofing. It was likely wrong about the intent. This was not a routine patrol. This was a setup. The Japanese ship cleared the lane. The water was now open between the Cole and the Alvand. The Iranian ship slowed down. It dropped from 36 knots to 20 knots. It was waiting. It was inviting the American destroyer to close the gap. The silence on the bridge was absolute. The only sound was the clicking of the cooling fans and the distant roar of the sea. The sun touched the water. It created a path of gold that led straight to the Iranian hull. "Something is wrong," the tactical officer whispered. He was right. The Iranian radar signal had changed. It was no longer a search pulse. It was a continuous wave. It was a lock. A hard, lethal lock. The intelligence assessment from 3 days ago had promised this could not happen. It had promised the Iranian systems were broken. But the alarms on the USS Cole were screaming. The ship was being targeted for a strike. The reality of the failure was now a physical weight in the room. The Iranians were ready to fire. The bridge of the USS Cole was a hive of controlled motion. The radar lock from the Iranian frigate was a constant, high-pitched whine from the electronic support consoles. This was the moment where the paper-thin reassurances of the intelligence brief dissolved completely. The assessment from 72 hours ago had stated the Alvand would be unable to maintain a stable fire control solution while traveling above 20 knots. The frigate was currently moving at 28 knots. The lock on the USS Cole was rock solid. "They are not just painting us," the tactical action officer shouted over the roar of the ventilation. "They have a firing solution for their K-102 missiles." Commander Hayes looked out at the darkening sea. The water was turning into a bruised purple under the dying light. The intelligence gap was widening with every second. The Iranians had not just repaired their ships, they had reinvented their tactics. They were not hiding. They were daring the United States Navy to fire first. Select the rolling airframe missiles. Hayes ordered, slave the close-in weapon system to the primary radar. If they blink, I want a wall of steel in the air. The ship was ready, but the rules of engagement were a cage. They could not fire until they were fired upon. They had to wait for the first move. The environment around them was closing in. The Iranian coast was a jagged silhouette of black rock only 5 miles to the north. The water depth was shallow. The sonar was picking up the rocky bottom. It created a cluttered acoustic environment that made it harder to detect potential torpedoes or mines. The signature element of the automated identification system spoofing began to stutter. The digital ghost of the Sea Pearl was finally dying. On the civilian screens of the ships nearby, the tanker symbol flickered and then vanished. It was replaced by the red triangle of a hostile warship. The Japanese container ship was already 2 miles away, running for the safety of the open sea. The Iranian frigate suddenly turned. It presented its broadside to the USS Cole. This was a classic firing posture. The launch canisters on its deck were angled toward the American destroyer. The air was thick with the smell of salt and the ozone from the high-powered radar arrays. The USS Cole was a massive target at this range, 600 yards, 500. The two ships were close enough for the bridge crews to see the white of the spray against the gray hulls. The intelligence reports had promised a weak enemy. The reality was a modern, aggressive combatant that was seconds away from a kill. The silence on the radio was the final proof. No more warnings. No more pleas for a course change. The world had shrunk down to the space between two ships. The sun disappeared. The light was gone. The water between the two warships was a churning, white-capped canyon. Destroyer DDG-67, USS Cole, was now executing the shoulder maneuver. It was a brutal display of seamanship and raw mass. Commander Hayes ordered the helmsman to bring the ship within 400 yards of the Iranian hull. The destroyer leaned hard to starboard. The sea surged up against the gray steel plates. The sound of the waves was a constant, deafening roar against the hull. The Iranian frigate, the Alvand, did not back down. It held its course. The two vessels were now racing side by side at 30 knots. The heat from the Iranian engines was a shimmering wall of distorted air between the ships. The smell of sulfur and heavy fuel oil was thick on the wind. The environment was a claustrophobic trap of spray and speed. To the north, the rocky cliffs of Iran loomed like teeth. To the south, the shipping lane was a crowded mess of steel. The signature element was finally dead. The digital display on the bridge no longer showed the Sea Pearl. The spoofing system had burned out under the strain of the high-speed chase. The screen now showed only the reality: a hostile warship in a firing position. The electronic support measures were screaming. The Iranian radar was locked on the bridge of the Cole. It was a digital finger on a trigger. "They are pushing us toward the shoals," the navigator shouted. He was right. The Iranian captain was using his smaller size to force the Cole into shallower water. The depth sounder was clicking rapidly. 40 meters, 35 meters. The USS Cole drew nearly 10 meters of water. If they hit the rocks at this speed, the ship would tear itself open. "Steady as she goes," Hayes said. She did not move. She watched the Iranian bridge. Through the spray, she saw the Iranian crew. They were not just standing at their stations. They were active. They were moving around the missile canisters on the midship's deck. The intelligence assessment from 3 days prior had claimed these launchers were rusted shut. It had assessed the loading mechanisms as non-functional due to a lack of spare parts. That assessment was a lie. The canisters were clean. The hydraulics were moving. The covers were retracting. The air around the Cole felt heavy. It was the weight of a coming storm. The sun had left a thin, red line on the horizon. The rest of the world was falling into a deep, ink-black shadow. The only lights were the glowing screens of the bridge and the occasional spark of static from the radar mast. The tactical action officer had his hand on the firing key for the 5-inch gun. "They have a lock, requesting permission to fire a warning shot." "Negative," Hayes replied. "We do not fire first. We hold the line." The physical tension was reaching a breaking point. The two ships were now less than 300 yards apart. The wake from the Iranian frigate was slamming into the side of the Cole. The destroyer shuddered with every impact. It was a rhythmic, violent shaking that rattled the teeth of every sailor on board. The intelligence failure was now total. The Iranians were not incompetent. They were not poorly equipped. They had led the most advanced destroyer in the world into a knife fight in a dark alley. The Iranian frigate suddenly slowed. It was a trap. It wanted the Cole to overreach. It wanted the destroyer to pull ahead so it could have a clear shot at the stern. "All engines back full," Hayes yelled. The ship groaned. The 4 gas turbines reversed their thrust. A massive wall of white water erupted from the stern. The USS Cole slowed with a violence that threw men against the bulkheads. The Iranian frigate was now directly ahead. Its missile canisters were pointed straight back at the bridge of the Cole. The silence that followed was the worst part. The only sound was the wind and the dying hum of the turbines. Then, the night was torn apart. A white-hot plume of fire erupted from the Iranian frigate's midships. The K-102 missile tore through its launch canister with a thunderous, metallic crack. The propellant cloud was a thick, chemical orange that smelled of sulfur and burning rubber. The shock wave of the launch physically rocked the smaller Iranian ship, sending a spray of seawater over its deck as the missile transitioned from the rail to the air. It was a blur of gray and flame. The missile traveled the short distance in less than 2 seconds. It punched straight through the portside superstructure of the USS Cole, 3 feet above the main deck. The aluminum plating did not just shatter. It shredded outward in jagged, white-hot ribbons. The warhead detonated inside the electronic warfare office, venting a column of fire and pulverized equipment through the starboard bulkheads. The air was instantly filled with the shrapnel of glass and circuit boards, slicing through the insulation like 1,000 knives. Commander Sarah Hayes was thrown violently against the port bridge window. Her shoulder hit the glass with a sickening thud, and she felt the breath leave her lungs as the ship whipped beneath her. Across the bridge, the tactical action officer was sent flying over his console, his hands clawing at the air before he slammed into the deck. The floor plates buckled, the anti-skid surface ripping under the force of the internal blast. For 10 seconds, the only sound was the roar of the fire and the scream of venting steam from a severed line. A thick, acrid cloud of black smoke began to pour from the jagged hole in the superstructure, mixing with the salt spray. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of metal groaning as the damaged section of the ship began to contract. In the cooler air of the evening, "Damage report!" Hayes gasped. She pulled herself up by the edge of the navigation table. Her arm was numb, a dull ache starting to radiate from her collarbone. The bridge was a scene of chaos. The red emergency lights were the only thing cutting through the thickening smoke. The smell was the worst part, a mixture of burnt plastic, scorched hair, and the sharp chemical bite of the missile's unspent fuel. The main tactical display was dark. The signature element, the electronic heart of the ship, was shattered. "Direct hit on the electronic warfare office, ma'am," the helmsman shouted. He was still at his station, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. He was still at his station, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Fires reported on decks 2 and 3. "We've lost the AN/SPY-1 radar. We are blind." The intelligence failure was now written in fire and blood. The Iranian frigate had not just fired, it had precision targeted the very systems that would have allowed the Cole to fight back effectively. The assessment that their targeting was degraded was a catastrophic error. They had known exactly where to hit to decapitate the destroyer's sensors. "Activate the auxiliary fire control," Hayes ordered, her voice regaining its steel. "Get the fire parties to the midships. I want that fire out now." The ship groaned as it heeled. The Iranian frigate was already pulling away, its engines screaming as it sought the safety of the rocky coast. It had delivered its blow. Now, it was the predator trying to escape the wounded lion. The deck shuddered again. This time, it was not an explosion. It was the sound of the 5-inch gun turret rotating. The sailors in the gunhouse were not waiting for the radar. They were using the optical sights. They were looking for revenge. The interior of the Electronic Warfare Office was a tomb of melted glass and shredded plastic. Smoke, thick and oily, vomited from the jagged rupture. In the hull, curling around the bent frames of the doorways. The heat was a physical wall, radiating from the warped, aluminum bulkheads that had once housed the ship's most sophisticated sensors. Water from a ruptured fire main hissed as it struck the glowing edges of the impact site, turning the compartment into a blinding, scalding sauna of steam and ash. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Miller lay pinned beneath the wreckage of a collapsed server rack. His breathing was shallow, a ragged sound that was barely audible over the crackle of secondary electrical fires. A shard of the missile's casing, a piece of dark, jagged alloy the size of a dinner plate, was embedded in the deck plating 6 inches from his head. His right arm was shattered, the bone white and stark against the dark blue of his coveralls. He didn't feel the pain yet. His body was in a state of deep, shivering shock. Damage control team to the Electronic Warfare Office. Move! The voice of the repair locker leader echoed through the smoke-filled corridor. 6 sailors, bulky in their fire-retardant suits and breathing apparatus, surged through the knee-deep water. The beam of their flashlights cut through the gloom, reflecting off the floating debris and the iridescent sheen of spilled hydraulic fluid. They moved with the frantic coordination of a team fighting for their lives. The deck beneath them was slick, making every step a gamble as the ship continued to heal into its turns. The unexpected damage was a direct result of the intelligence failure. The United States Navy had entered this engagement, believing the Alvand's targeting systems were blind. Instead, the Iranian frigate had delivered a surgical strike. The impact had not just caused a fire, it had severed the primary data bus for the ANSPY-1 radar. The USS Cole, a billion-dollar platform designed to track 100 targets at once, was now effectively sightless. The massive phased array antennas on the superstructure were intact, but the brain that translated their signals into a tactical picture had been incinerated in the first second of the blast. On the bridge, the smell of burnt electrical insulation was overwhelming. It was a sharp, chemical sting that sat in the back of the throat. Commander Sarah Hayes wiped a smear of soot from her forehead, her fingers trembling slightly. The red emergency lighting gave the room a hellish, underwater glow. The secondary displays were flickering, struggling to stay alive as the auxiliary power units kicked in. Status on the fire? Hayes demanded. Main fire is being suppressed, ma'am, the executive officer reported. He was holding a blood-stained rag to a cut on his cheek, but the Electronic Warfare Office is gone. We've lost Chief Miller and 2 technicians. The ship's defensive suite is offline. If they fire another missile, we can't jam it. The physical reality of the strike was settling into the bones of the crew. This wasn't a training exercise with plastic simulators. The deck was vibrating with a new, uneven rhythm, the sound of a ship that was wounded and off balance. The hull plates near the impact site groaned with every wave, a sound like a giant grinding its teeth. The sea was no longer just the environment. It was a threat, pushing against the weakened steel, looking for a way. Inside. Outside, the Iranian frigate was a dark, receding ghost. It was moving toward the safety of the 12-mile limit, its own wake a white scar on the black water. The Iranian captain had gambled on a single, lethal blow, and the intelligence failure of the 5th Fleet had handed him the winning card. The auxiliary fire control is coming up, the tactical action officer shouted, his voice cracking with adrenaline. We have a visual on the Alvand through the 5-inch gun's optical tracker. We don't have radar, but we have eyes. The USS Cole was a wounded predator, but it was not dead. The 5-inch gun turret on the bow began to hum as it slewed to starboard. The long, gray barrel rose, seeking the horizon. The heat from the fires midships was still rising, creating a shimmering distortion in the air, but the gun crew was locked in. They were operating on raw instinct and the mechanical backup systems that didn't rely on the destroyed data bus. The salt spray hit the bridge, windows again, leaving fresh streaks of white across the soot. The wind was howling through the hole in the superstructure, a low, mournful whistle that sounded like the ship itself was in pain. Commander Hayes looked at the screen. The signature element was gone. The AIS spoofing a distant memory. The world was now simple. There was the ship that had bled them, and there was the steel they were about to send back. Match bearings, Hayes ordered. If they so much as twitch a launcher, take them out of the water. Match bearings, Hayes ordered. If they so much as twitch a launcher, take them out of the water. Match bearings, Hayes ordered. If they so much as twitch a launcher, take them out of the water. The bow of the destroyer, DDG-67, heaved as it punched through a 3-meter swell. On the forward deck, the Mark 45, 5-inch gun turret slewed with a mechanical, predatory grace. There was no radar data to guide it. The sophisticated brain of the ship was a melted ruin of silicon and copper 2 decks below, but the sailors in the gunhouse were using the optical sighting system. They were looking through a lens, tracking the dark shape of the Iranian frigate against the white foam of its own wake. "Target is locked," the gunner shouted. His voice was raw from the smoke. The Iranian frigate was 1,500 yards ahead, desperately trying to reach the sanctuary of the coastal shallows. It had banked hard to starboard, its hull leaning into the turn. The Iranian captain knew the destroyer was wounded. He likely thought the American ship was paralyzed, but the 5-inch gun did not need a mainframe to kill. Commander Hayes stood on the bridge, her hand white-knuckled on the frame of the captain's chair. Fire. The gun barked with a sound that felt like a physical punch to the chest of every sailor on the bridge. A massive tongue of orange flame and gray cordite smoke erupted from the muzzle, instantly obscured by the salt spray. The ship bucked under the recoil, the 8,900 tons of steel absorbing the energy with a deep, metallic groan. The first 70-pound projectile tore through the air at 3 times the speed of sound. It did not hit the hull. It struck the water 50 yards short, sending a towering geyser of white spray into the air. The gun adjusted instantly, the barrel dropping by a fraction of a degree. The second round was a direct hit. It punched through the Iranian frigate's stern right above the waterline. The high-explosive shell detonated inside the steering gear room. The impact did not just break the rudder. It vaporized the hydraulic pumps and sent shards of the hull plating spinning into the sea. The back of the Iranian ship lifted, out of the water, the propellers screaming in the open air for a split second before the vessel slammed back down into the chop. The frigate began to slew wildly to port, its steering dead. It was no longer a warship. It was a drifting target. "Again," Hayes ordered. Her eyes were fixed on the thermal monitor. The 5-inch gun fired 3 more times in rapid succession. The rhythm was a steady, deafening beat. Boom, reload, boom. The projectiles drove into the Iranian midships, shredding the aluminum superstructure. One shell hit the base of the funnel, and a column of white steam and black soot erupted into the night sky. The Iranian engines, which the intelligence brief had assessed as unreliable but had actually proven dangerously fast, finally gave up. The frigate slowed, its wake dying into a confused swirl of bubbles and oil. The environment of the strait was now a scene of localized devastation. The smell of burnt powder from the Cole's own gun mixed with the acrid stink of the oil fire burning on the Alvand. The wind had died down, leaving the 2 ships to drift in the heavy, humid silence of the Persian Gulf. The only sound was the crackle of the flames and the distant, rhythmic thud of the Cole's auxiliary power units. The signature element was a dead memory. The AIS spoofing system on the Iranian ship was gone, its electronics crushed by the American shells. On every screen in the region, the Sea Pearl ghost had vanished. The reality was 2 wounded giants, one bleeding smoke, and the other dead in the water, only 4 miles from the Iranian coast. "Cease fire," Hayes commanded. The gun barrel lowered, the heat shimmering off the steel in the red glow of the emergency lights. The Iranian ship was still afloat, but its mast was tilted, and its decks were a chaotic mess of twisted metal. No more missiles would be coming from those launchers. "Damage control? Status?" Hayes asked into her headset. Fire in the electronic warfare office is under control, ma'am, the executive officer replied, but we are taking on water through the hull breach on deck 2. The pumps are holding, but the internal bulkheads are strained. The USS Cole had won the exchange, but the price was etched into the very structure of the ship. The destroyer had proven its lethality, but it was limping. The intelligence failure had invited a blow that should never have landed, and now the crew had to live with the physical consequences of that error. "Prepare the boarding team," Hayes said, "and get a medical detail ready. We have men down." The ship moved slowly toward the drifting frigate. The water was dark, reflecting the orange flickers of the fires. The mission was accomplished. The shipping lane was open, but the victory felt heavy, like the salt air pressing against the bridge windows. 8:30 in the evening. The Persian Gulf. The Iranian frigate, the Alvand, was a jagged, blackened silhouette against the moonlit water 4 miles off the coast of Iran. It was no longer moving. It was a dead thing, drifting on the tide, with white steam still hissing from its shattered engine room. The orange glow of internal fires flickered through the shell holes in its hull, casting long, dancing shadows across the surface of the sea. There were no more digital ghosts. The signature element, the spoofed transponder signal of the Sea Pearl, had finally been silenced by American steel. Destroyer DDG-67, the USS Cole, stood 1,000 yards away, its own engines idling with a low, uneven thrum. The ship was not the proud, pristine predator that had entered the strait 6 hours earlier. A massive, ragged wound stood open on its port side, the edges of the steel curled back like the lips of a predator's snarl. Black soot stained the gray paint from the waterline to the top of the bridge, and the air around the ship was thick with the smell of salt spray, burnt copper, and the cold, metallic scent of a fire that had only recently been smothered. Inside the ship, the silence was more oppressive than the noise of the battle had been. The emergency lighting cast a dim, red haze over the corridors, making the water on the deck plates look like spilled ink. Commander Sarah Hayes walked through the passageway toward the electronic warfare office. Her shoulder was wrapped in a white bandage that was already starting to show a spot of red, but she did not seem to feel the pain. She stopped at the hatch of the destroyed compartment. The intelligence failure was no longer a sequence of words in a briefing. It was a physical reality. The Fifth Fleet Electronic Warfare Assessment had promised that the Iranians were incapable of this. They had assessed the enemy as blind and technologically inferior. Because of that assessment, the Cole had been positioned in a way that left its most sensitive sensors vulnerable. The result was laid bare in the charred ruins of the office. The AN/SPY-1 radar data bus was a melted slag of fiber optics and gold. The ship was no longer a technological marvel. It was a wounded lion, surviving on instinct and manual backups. "We have the final count, ma'am," the executive officer said. He stood behind her, his voice low and devoid of the adrenaline from an hour ago. Commander Hayes did not turn around. She looked into the blackened room. "Tell me, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Miller died of his injuries 10 minutes ago," the executive officer stated. The words were flat, heavy. Petty Officer Second Class David Chen and Seaman Apprentice Lucas Reed were killed instantly when the warhead detonated. 11 others are in the medical bay with flash burns and shrapnel wounds. 3 of them are critical. Hayes nodded once. The names were more than just entries on a manifest. Miller had been with the ship for 3 years. He had a wife and 2 daughters in Norfolk. Chen was a gifted technician who spent his off hours teaching the younger sailors how to calibrate the very systems that had failed to protect him. Reed was 19 years old. On his first deployment, a boy who had only wanted to see the world beyond the cornfields of Iowa. The victory felt hollow. Tactically, the mission was a success. The Japanese container ship was safely in the Gulf of Oman. The Iranian provocation had been met with decisive, overwhelming force. The international shipping lane remained open, the throat of the global economy still breathing. But as the smoke cleared, the cost of that success was etched into the steel of the ship and the hearts of the crew. The USS Cole began to move, turning slowly away from the Iranian coast. It did not move with the grace of a hunter. It moved with the heavy, labored gait of the injured. The wind whistled through the jagged hole in the superstructure, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the empty bunks in the berthing area. The final image of the night was not the burning Iranian frigate or the glint of the 5-inch gun. It was the sight of 3 empty racks in the crew quarters, the blankets still tucked in tight, the personal effects of 3 men sitting on the small metal lockers. There was a photo of a family, a half-finished book, and a letter home that would never be mailed. The mission was accomplished, the objective was secured, and the threat was neutralized. But in the red-lit quiet of the destroyer, the only thing that remained was the honest, crushing weight of what it had cost to hold the line.